Okie doke.
Got it.
So here we go. So how long does the access to work process take from the day of from the day the application is submitted?
Okay. There is going to be some variation on that answer depending whereabouts in the country that you are, because it does vary a little bit. If you'd have asked me that question several months ago, I would have said that it can take up to 12 months, and there are plenty of anecdotes that say it can take a lot longer than that. However, it has got a lot better recently, a lot quicker, and I would say that typically at the moment we're probably working around sort of between 5 and 7 months, I think. That's probably fair to say.
Yeah, I've seen, I know from speaking with the team at DWP, they acknowledge the delays, and they are doing a huge amount in order to speed it up. And it's kind of like trying to turn a cruise ship. It's going to take time, but the things that they are doing really seem to be having an impact. So yeah, kudos to them.
Yeah. It's at the end of the day, it is a government funded scheme, and therefore it is under-resourced.
Yeah,
that's just how it works, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And from the people I've spoken to, they're doing some really great things to try and make changes. And what I've seen, and you alluded to, it does seem to be making a difference, but it's just going to take time.
And also there's a positive aspect to it as well. I mean, the reason that it can take a while is because they're so busy. And the reason they're so busy is because we're all getting this greater awareness of it. There's more sort of understanding around neurodifference in the workplace and access to work. I mean, it's good that it's busy on one hand.
Absolutely. The next question is, if an employee has been given a piece of oh, sorry, we've actually already answered that one. So we'll
good.
Says, hi Mark, do you have any idea of what adjustments you may need before applying for access to work, or is discovery part of the process? So I think the question is kind of, do you need to know what you need before you go to access to work, or are you supported in finding out what might be used?
That's a fair question. The answer is you do not need to know. Okay, the assessor's role, if you like, is to be knowledgeable in that type of area, and they will ask very exploratory questions to help them make the right choices. That said, it's great if you can go along with an understanding of what you think might help. Now, that may be because you've had some adjustments before, perhaps in a different role, or maybe even going through education. And if you've got an idea of something that you know would be helpful, assessors are really grateful for those sorts of conversations as well. Okay, but to answer your question, no, you don't need to know.
Brilliant. There's a question here. You mentioned during your talk that civil service is excluded from access to work. Is there a reason for that?
There are lots of reasons. I'm not going to lie, I don't entirely understand the reasoning myself totally, but it's to do with conflicts of interest and so on and so forth, and the fact that it's the government that sort of oversees and manages that fund and process. So they kind of excuse themselves from that fund and process. But it's not really a big deal because they have extremely effective methods and other pathways of getting support in for themselves as well. And there are organisations that exist to support civil servants in exactly the same way too. Okay. But yeah.
That makes perfect sense. Does access to work cover postgraduate researchers and PhD students? Are there any restrictions for students on placements for access to work as well?
Good question. Okay, and I'm not going to pretend to totally know the answer to this one. Okay, because I think that's the point at which there's a bit of a blurring between what's classed as a job and what's classed as an educational role. Okay, and I think it will depend a lot on the terms of that particular individual's role, but either access to work would cover it, or the disabled students allowance would cover it. One way or another, that role would be covered, but I'm not going to pretend to know the answer to that question definitively. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have a feeling that PhD students, there's like other funding routes available. Again, I don't know the detail, but I'm sure I've been in conversation.
One thing I would say though is again, don't don't worry if that's not clear, because I would still have that conversation with Access to Work, because one of the things they are brilliant at is signposting you where necessary. Okay, so they would still be a really good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question is, how can a new employee, sorry, access to work if they haven't started day one of employment but have accepted an offer?
Okay, that's cool. That's actually a relatively simple one to answer. I like that one. As long as there is proof of an offer of employment, you know, a letter of acceptance, a start date, etc., then you can start that access to work process. They're quite happy with that.
And there's a good question here, which is kind of something we touched on before, which is there a way to give feedback to assessors, as this individual regularly has people who have support recommended that can't be put in place because of GDPR and data handling issues?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not aware of a formal mechanism for leaving feedback. Okay. It's relatively easy to feedback to the assessor themselves, and what also happens is that everybody who applies for access to work will be allocated a sort of a case manager, if you like. So yes, you can feedback to them. You'll have open routes of communication with them. That's relatively straightforward. What then happens to that feedback and whether it's acted on and so on, I'm honestly not sure, but I'm not aware of any formal feedback route. No.
That's a really interesting question, because there's always going to be nuances around people's IT systems that mean that certain pieces of software can't be applied, but then there are also core bits, core there's especially from an information security perspective, there are core requirements at most workplaces that mean if they're not met, then you're not going to be able to put in place certain pieces of tech, in particular in a large group of organizations. So getting that information back is super important.
It's another reason why actually it can be a really good practice to have a single point of supply for all of your access to work requirements, because that single source of reply will be able to advise and will get to know your business and will be able to sort of help you with those types of things, because there will be ways around it and there will be alternatives. But a really good question. I've never been asked that one before.
Here's a question. Once an employer has agreed to reasonable adjustments, such as flexible start times or working from home, can they at a later point change that or remove that adjustment because the adjustment, for instance, no longer suits the organization?
If for some reason that adjustment becomes unreasonable, if it switches from being a reasonable adjustment to an unreasonable adjustment for whatever reason, yes, they can. There's no reason why that can't happen. And in fact, I would argue that it's actually quite good practice to regularly review adjustments anyway, for both sides of the equation. But yes, I mean, there's, again, going back to the Equality Act, the organisation has an obligation to provide reasonable adjustments. Okay, and as long as those adjustments stay reasonable, then there really isn't a reason to remove them. But there are many reasons why something can become unreasonable.
No, that's a very good answer. The interesting one here. What checks are in place to ensure an employee doesn't overinflate their needs?
It's not. Oh, sorry, an employee overinflates their needs.
Yes, sorry, an employee.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question, and it's got lots of different nuances to it. So, it's really down to this. It's really down to the experience of the assessor, if I'm being honest. If the assessor makes recommendations, then I think we have to accept that those recommendations are thought through. When an assessor makes a recommendation, they will always put the justification for a recommendation there as well. So they will explain what that recommendation does and how it might support this particular person in their particular role. So there will be a justification there. Okay. I think it's very unlikely that an assessor will be overly influenced by an employee who just wants lots of things rather than needs lots of things. Not going to say it can't happen, but I really don't think it's that common.
Perfect, thank you. This question's regarding ergonomic assessments. If whilst conducting a remote assessment, an assessor considers a client needs ergonomic furniture and accessories in the workplace, who recommends the specific equipment? And if it is the assessor, would they visit and do an on-site, visit on-site to do so? So I guess how does it go from saying you need generic ergonomic support to this specific equipment, and then visiting on site to sort of organize?
Well, this is one of the reasons why that initial phone conversation, once you've filled in the form online, you'll get an initial phone call back from Access to Work, and that's the reason for that phone call. It's to ask those sorts of questions. So are there reasons why this particular assessment should be carried out on site as opposed to remotely? Okay. And if there are sort of complicated or complex ergonomic things to take into consideration, that would be a really good reason for saying we need to do this one in person. Okay. And that's kind of how that works. All right. And there are no difficulties with ergonomic recommendations. Access to Work are quite happy to make ergonomic recommendations, as long as those requirements are as a result of a disability. Okay. So that's quite common. But yeah, I think, again, that's why that conversation is so important, and that's where those questions will get asked.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. So here's a question. If somebody, what are the options if somebody gets declined the grant due to no formal diagnosis? Is there other options available to them? In my understanding is you don't need a formal diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, they shouldn't be declined because of no formal diagnosis. Okay, as long as there are reasonable reasons to think that a disability exists, then that should not be an issue. Okay, so it should not be because there is no formal diagnosis. And if you ever are, then I would go back and complain and argue that. But on a slightly bigger note, actually, what if generally you are not happy with the results of your assessment, with the level of recommendations? And there is no formal route of appeal for a workplace Access to Work assessment, but everyone has the right to have their assessment reconsidered once. Okay, so that's open to everybody.
Oh, that's good to know. That maybe feeds into the next question. If someone has been recommended one of the methods of support, but they think it would be, but they think something else would be useful, can they request that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. One of the nice things about Access to Work is that the assessors are quite open to these sorts of conversations. Okay, so yes, you will have communication channels with your assessor and with your case handler, if you like, and you can go back and have all those sorts of conversations, and they're quite open to those as well. That is not a problem.
Interesting, but quite a specific one here. Can you give any advice to organisations for claiming back money from DWP for support workers, admin, driver grants? Most of the claim forms tend to be aimed at individuals reclaiming the money rather than the organisation.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. It can get a little bit complicated, and there are hoops to jump through, and that process, especially around support workers and travel costs and so on and so forth, can be quite onerous. I'm not aware of any sort of tricks or hacks or shortcuts that you can take. It kind of has to be the process. But what I would suggest is that you try, if possible, to find support organisations that are used to working with the Access to Work system, because you're likely to get all the paperwork and all the receipts, etc., in a format that they need and that they require, and it's going to make the admin a lot easier. But the system for claiming back costs has always been a little bit clunky. It's got better, but I'm not going to pretend that it's not still quite clunky. And this is one of the areas where, although technically it's on the employee to manage this process, actually, this is where organizations can really, really help by supporting employees with these types of process. Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I answered that question without answering that question. I'm sorry.
No, you definitely did. A question here about hybrid work, and if people have kit at home, which may also benefit them personally, are they going to be asked to contribute some money towards that, or is it going to be covered by access to work?
Potentially, okay. That is in the terms and conditions of access to work, okay. If an individual is going to derive benefit from that adjustment outside of work, then technically it doesn't fall under the auspices of access to work. So there may be a case that you would have to make a contribution in that situation. Personally, I don't know of any such cases, but I'm not going to say that they don't exist, but it is definitely a potential thing. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a really interesting one about the about suppliers. So if the access to work, I guess the sort of the assessment includes a specific supplier, but for the organization that supplier isn't approved, you know, by the employer, what should they do? Because it sounds like this person's having trouble where they've the recommendation says, you know, we want to purchase, you should be purchasing at this cost from this supplier, but the employer isn't able to purchase it from that supplier.
Yeah, okay. So I guess there's probably a couple of sort of ways to go with that one. So first of all, there are some things that I can think of that can only be sourced from a single source of supply. Okay. In which case, you know, if that's the recommendation, then that's kind of what you've got to do. But it's also important to know that just because Access to Work have recommended a supplier for a particular thing, Access to Work don't really care where you source it from. Okay, as long as it doesn't cost any more than the money than the cost they've allowed for in that report, they don't mind where you source it from. In the case of bits of equipment that can only be sourced from one supplier, and I've got to be honest, that's kind of rare, but in those cases, if that supplier isn't recognized as a supplier, then we really come back to the question of, is it a reasonable adjustment? Okay, and the organization will need to ask themselves questions like, is it unreasonable that we have to set up a new provider for this? Is it unreasonable that we've got to go through the paperwork of creating a new bunch of invoices? Those sorts of questions. It becomes a question of reasonability then. All right, but I've got to say that's, in my experience, it's kind of going to be few and far between. It's going to need to be quite specialist equipment, I think. Generally speaking, the Access to Work recommendations are just that. They're recommended suppliers, and you will get different recommendations from different Access to Work assessors as well. Okay.
Thank you. Cheers, Mark. We've got only a few more kind of questions left. So can you say a bit about the process with access to work when the employer has their own occupational health department? Does occupational health then usually lead the conversations with regards to access to work?
Yeah, I don't think there's a right or wrong way around this, to be honest with you. Occupational health should know about access to work and should be able to signpost that to someone for whom it would be worthwhile. Okay, but there's nothing wrong with an employee going to Access to Work and then going to the occupational health as well. It really doesn't matter. But what's quite normal as well is for some larger organizations to actually just bypass Access to Work entirely and not use Access to Work. For a large organization that's expected to make a much larger contribution, sometimes the costs outweigh the benefits. So they will provide the assessment themselves. They'll have a provider that will do the assessment independently, and then they will again go through that process of making those adjustments and sourcing the supplies. That's quite normal. But I don't think there's a right and wrong way of doing it, if I'm being honest. Occupational health is there to sort of signpost these types of things as well, but also to provide more sort of complex support as well. Organizations will usually have processes. Always check that first. Perhaps have a conversation with somebody in HR. Is there a process as an organization? Do we have a pathway for this? Okay. But in my experience, it genuinely doesn't really matter. Okay. In fact, in my experience, occupational health providers quite like it when you've been to Access to Work, because it gives them a lot of additional information.
Great, thank you. Can Access to Work fund support for communication and mobility aids, or are there items seen as supporting people mostly in their daily lives rather than in work, and therefore would be sort of excluded?
Now, that's a good question. They can do, absolutely. But again, I think the balance is going to be whether that adjustment is going to be sort of more for work or more for personal. If it's more for work, then yeah, absolutely, I would expect that to be funded. But at the same time, I would also not be surprised if you would be expected to make a contribution toward that as well. So it's definitely not a no, never, but it is much more of a really depends on the situation type of answer.
Yeah, no, that makes sense and links back to that question earlier about contribution. So yes, thank you. Does a company, this is a slightly off-piste, so this is a slightly off-piste one, which is, how does a company get registered to supply Access to Work services? Where can we find out about accreditation, auditing requirements? It might not be something that's, yeah, in your bag, but yeah, any idea?
Yeah, it's a good question. And truthfully, I'm not entirely sure I know the answer to that. That certainly that there isn't an accreditation. It's let me think about how I answer that question. I think if you're an organization that has a product that is of worthwhile and can really provide a benefit in those areas, then it might well be worth, rather than actually trying to access to work yourself, but trying to find sort of a partner organization that's already supplying Access to Work and sort of partner via them or make your product available through them. That's probably certainly the easiest route to go, because again, being a supplier into Access to Work does come with some challenges as well. So yeah, again, it's another one of those questions that I'm going to answer without really answering, I think.
Thank you. That's yeah, it's a quite specific question, I think, and yeah, I think your advice regarding partnering is is a really good idea. And otherwise, I guess it's going to be doing some intense googling and seeing if you can find a pathway somewhere on the old government website. But yeah,
and it won't be easy because there isn't really a pathway. It would be great if there was an accreditation, and once you've got it, you appeared magically on a list, and that was the end of it. But it doesn't work like that, unfortunately.
I think this would be the last question. So can a manager complete the claim form as soon as the order's been placed for equipment and training, or do they have to wait until it's been delivered?
No, I think they can do it straight away. They need the invoice, I think, to claim. So yeah, I don't see any reason why they'd have to wait. No, not at all. They can do that straight away.
But there is actually one last question. I lied.
Yeah.
I had an ex-student from higher education who told me that he had to find his own Access to Work person, which he had no idea how to do. Is that normal?
Unfortunately, it's something that we hear quite a lot. Yes, and it does make things quite difficult. Again, it's one of those things that Access to Work can't mandate that an organization supports their employees with this, but it can help massively, because finding support workers isn't always easy. And then there's the sort of the management of the process itself, keeping track of invoices and receipts and so on and so forth. It can be really, really challenging. And sometimes it's very difficult to know where to start. And unfortunately, Access to Work don't always give recommendations for where to find support workers. So yeah, it's not mandatory that an organization supports their employees with these processes, but yeah, it'd be a nice thing to do, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Well, Mark, that's the last question. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for that.